A corrupt sheriff and judge framed dozens, but this woman made them pay. Defense attorney Ava Mitchell takes on what seems like a routine case, but uncovers a horrifying conspiracy. Ava Mitchell gripped the case file tightly as she stepped out of the car, her heels sinking slightly into the loose gravel of the courthouse parking lot. Ashton Ridge was smaller than she lazily at an empty intersection, and a row of faded storefronts lined the main street. The weight of a dozen suspicious stares pressed on her before she even reached the courthouse steps. Inside, the air was thick with humidity and stale coffee. Sheriff Tom Calloway leaned against the front desk, arms folded across his broad chest. He barely glanced at her before turning back to his conversation and approached the receptionist. "I'm here to see my client, Mark Johnson," she said, keeping her voice even. The woman behind the desk, Linda, according to the nameplate, didn't look up from her paperwork. "Visiting hours are over. They said I could see him until 5. It's 4:30. Linda clicked her pen shut and finally looked at Ava, her lips curling slightly. Calloway pushed off the desk with an exaggerated sigh. "Miss Mitchell, right? I heard you were coming. Folks around here don't take kindly to outsiders meddling in business that ain't theirs." Ava held her ground. "Justice is my business. I'd like to see my client now." The sheriff studied her for a moment, then motioned for a deputy. "Take her down. 5 minutes." The holding cells were dim, a single flickering light casting long his hands resting in his lap. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes guarded. "Mark," she greeted, pulling a chair closer. "I'm your attorney. We're going to get through this." He gave a short nod. "You sure about that? The evidence against you is weak. They have nothing solid." There was no weapon. She glanced over the file. "No motive established. The only thing they have is a grainy security video that shows a figure at the scene, someone who isn't clearly you." Mark exhaled sharply. "They don't care about the truth." Ava leaned in. "I do. Tell me exactly where you were that night." "At home. Alone." "Not the best alibi." He let out a humorless laugh. "It's the truth. We'll prove it." Before she could say more, the deputy rapped on the bars. "Time's up." Back in the main hall, she gathered her things quickly. She could feel Calloway watching her as she left the building. As soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk, voices hushed, eyes burning into her back. It wasn't just suspicion, it was the only one in town, a squat building with peeling paint and a buzzing neon vacancy sign. Inside, the walls were thin, the sheets rough, but she had no time to dwell on the discomfort. She spread the case files across the small table, marking inconsistencies in the reports, noting gaps in witness statements. Something wasn't right. She spun a sharp crack as glass sprayed across the room. A brick landed at her feet, a piece of paper wrapped around it. Her pulse hammered as she unfolded the note. Ava stared at the words, her jaw tightening. She had handled threats before, but this felt different. Whoever had sent it wasn't bluffing. "Hey, it's me. She pulled out her phone. "I need someone to run a background check on the Hargroves and Calloway. Something isn't adding up." A long pause. "Ava, are you sure you want to do this?" Her eyes flicked to the shattered window. "I'm already in it. Might as well find out why they want me gone." She hung up and swept the glass from the table, ignoring the prickle of unease creeping up her spine. If they thought they could scare her off, just beginning. They were wrong. The next morning, Ava drove to a modest house on the outskirts of town. Mark's mother, Lena Williams, opened the door cautiously, her face drawn with exhaustion. She stepped aside to let Ava in, glancing toward the street before shutting the door. "My son didn't do this," Lena said. "I know because I saw him." "Would you be willing to testify to that in court?" Ava asked, pulling out her notebook. Lena's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ain't nobody in this town willing to stand up against them. You think I'd be the first?" She shook her head. "People who cross the Hargroves, they disappear." Ava studied her, noting the fear buried behind her defiant expression. Lena hesitated before nodding. "Look up the old cases. You'll see." Determined, Ava spent the rest of the afternoon buried in courthouse records. It didn't take long to find a pattern. Black defendants charged with crimes they didn't commit. Trials rushed, convictions secured. Some never made it to trial at all. Names vanished from legal documents.
A knock on
Their
the
cases
library
table
mysteriously
made her
closed.
jump. She turned to see William Tate, a retired lawyer, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You're digging in the wrong place," he muttered, sliding into the chair across from her. "I tried once. Didn't end well." Ava's pulse quickened. "What happened?" He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Drop the case. Get out while you can." Before she could ask
stared
more,
after him,
he stood and
his
walked
warning
away, settling in her chest like a stone. That night, as she drove back from visiting Mark in jail, headlights flared behind her. A truck roared up, slamming into her bumper. Her car veered off the road, tires screaming against the pavement. Another hit sent her skidding into the ditch. Two men jumped out, their faces covered by masks. One carried a length of rope.
She yanked the door
Adrenaline
handle,
surged,
through Ava.
scrambling out just as they closed in. The forest loomed ahead. She ran, branches tearing at her clothes, the sound of heavy boots pounding behind her. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Next morning, Ava sat in Sheriff Calloway's office, her jaw set. Across from her, Calloway leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Lost control of your car,
I
huh?"
was forced off
he
the
said.
road. His tone
Ava
light.
replied. He shrugged. "Maybe you were driving too fast. Happens all the time around here." She didn't respond, just stood and walked out, her blood boiling. He knew exactly what had happened, and he wasn't going to do a thing about it. Back at the motel, she stopped short when she saw her door. The lock looked fine, but the gap between the frame and the wood had widened slightly.
She stepped in cautiously.
Someone had been inside. The
inside.
case files on the table were no longer where she had left them. Her notes, scribbled observations, inconsistencies she had highlighted, were shuffled like someone had gone through them and put them back in a hurry. Then she saw the note, a torn scrap of paper sitting in the center of her desk. "Drop the case or you'll end up like the rest." She clenched her fists. The warning wasn't subtle,
but it didn't
determined.
matter.
She dug into the case even further, and soon she found the connection. Frankie Dawson, the prosecution's star witness, had been paid off. She tracked him down at his rundown house on the edge of town. He answered the door, eyes darting behind her nervously. "I need you to tell the truth, Frankie," she said, "before it's too late." Frankie hesitated, then
I'll
nodded
give you what you
slowly.
need. Meet me
But tomorrow never came. That night, his house burned to the ground, with him inside. Ava stared at the wreckage the next morning, bile rising in her throat. The fire had been deliberate. Someone wanted to make sure Frankie never spoke. In court, the judge dismissed her attempt to introduce evidence of bribery.
Desperate,
Mark remained. Ava
the
made a
prime
risky
suspect.
move. She broke into the sheriff's office after dark, searching for anything that could blow the case open. She rifled through the drawers in Calloway's office, hands moving fast. Then she found a file buried in the back of a locked cabinet. Inside, clipped to the first page, was a handwritten note. "Make sure he takes the fall. The boss wants this cleaned up."
Proof.
Ava's that
stomach
Mark was
turned.
being framed. But before she could take another breath, the door creaked behind her. A shadow fell across the floor. "Going somewhere?" Calloway's voice was low, almost amused. His hand rested on the gun at his hip. Ava turned, pulse hammering. Before she could react, two deputies stepped in,
You're under arrest
slamming
for
cuffs
breaking
and
into her
entering.
wrists.
Calloway said, smirking as he tightened the cuffs. "Should have stayed in your lane, counselor." She was shoved into a holding cell, the metal bars rattling shut behind her. In the dim light, she saw Mark on the opposite bench. He sat up, startled. "They got you too?" "On false charges,"
Not the first
she
time
muttered,
they've done
rubbing
this,
her
I'm
wrist. Sure. Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I heard something in here. The guys in the back cells, they whisper about a place outside town. An old plantation. They say people disappear there." Ava narrowed her eyes. "Disappear how?" He hesitated. "Buried." That night, a figure slipped into the darkened corridor. Deputy Noah Brooks. He crouched by her
They
cell
plan to
and
get
murmured,
rid of you before
"You need to
trial."
go." Ava's breath caught. "Why are you telling me this?" Brooks hesitated before pulling a key from his pocket. "Because I know what happens to people who don't listen." Ava glanced at Mark. Him too. Brooks exhaled sharply but unlocked both cells. You owe me. They slipped out into the night. Ava bribed Brooks with the last of her cash for a car. She drove through the winding roads toward the plantation ruins. The land was eerie, the skeletal remains of a mansion barely standing. Digging with her hands, Ava's fingers scraped something hard. Bone. She pulled out her phone, snapping photos. The ground held secrets, bodies from long ago, and some that weren't so old. A crunch of boots on dirt made her freeze, landing on her face. Calloway. Behind him, Judge Hargrove and Hargrove. Well, Calloway drawled, stepping closer. Looks like you found something you shouldn't have. Ava tensed, glancing at Mark. They had uncovered the town's darkest secret. But now, they had to survive it. Calloway took another step forward.
Should have left
His
when
boots
you had the
crunching
chance,
against the dirt, he said, raising his gun. Ava's breath caught. Behind him, Judge Hargrove and Hargrove stood stone-faced, their presence solidifying everything she had feared. This wasn't just corruption. It was a system built on blood. The judge spoke first. For decades, we've kept order in this town. People like Mark Johnson don't belong here. People like Mark Johnson? Ava spat. Almost you mean bored. Innocent men? You don't get it, do you? He gestured to the graves Ava had uncovered. This is justice. The way it has always been. Mark shifted beside her, his fists clenched. You pinned a murder on me to cover up your own crimes, he said, voice low and furious. Did you kill that boy? Hargrove scoffed. Not me, but my son, Elliot. Well, boys make mistakes. Ava felt nausea rise for your son. Before the judge could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the night. Gunfire. Chaos erupted as Deputy Noah Brooks stepped from the darkness, his weapon drawn. Put it down, Sheriff. Calloway whipped around, but Noah fired first, the bullet tearing into his shoulder. He collapsed with a reaching for his own gun, but Noah fired again, striking the ground inches from his feet. Try it, and the next one goes through your skull. The judge raised his hands, his face pale. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. Noah snapped. I'm ending this. Ava wasted no time. She grabbed Mark's arm, yanking him toward the tree line. A scream rang out behind them as they ran, but Ava didn't stop to look back. Lena Williams was waiting near the road, eyes wide with terror. You found it? Lena gasped. Ava nodded. And they found us. The three of them disappeared into the night, leaving behind the horror of Ashton Ridge's darkest secret. Ava's heart pounded as she and Lena Williams ran through the darkness, leaving the plantation the back road. Dawn was beginning to break over Ashton Ridge. This isn't over, Ava gasped between breaths. We need to go public now. They didn't stop. Not until they reached the town's heart, the courthouse. The grand white pillars gleamed in the early morning light, a stark contrast to the rock that she pulled out her phone and hit live. Listen to me, she said, her voice breathless yet fierce. They've been hiding something for decades. The video broadcasted live to thousands within seconds. Lena, still clutching her son's case file, lifted her chin and spoke with the voice of a mother who had suffered too much. My son was framed. This town has been covering up murders for years. The courthouse doors burst open. People stirred from their homes, drawn by the urgency in Ava's voice. Neighbors, old shopkeepers, and reporters who had dismissed her days ago now stared at their phones, watching the truth spill out. Then came the sirens. FBI agents swarmed the building. Dark-suited figures pushed past the crowd and through the town's darkest secrets cracked open. The once untouchable men Sheriff Calloway, Judge Hargrove, and Hargrove were led out in cuffs. Their faces, once smug and full of power, now dripped with fear. You don't know what you're doing, Judge Hargrove hissed as he was shoved toward a waiting car. This town needs men like us. No, Ava shot back, standing her ground. A hush fell over the crowd as the full weight of the revelation settled in. Reporters fired off questions, their cameras flashing. How long has this been happening? How many victims? The answers came swiftly. Dozens of missing black men, lives erased to keep the town's power structure intact. Their names, long buried in silence, were now spoken
Mark
aloud.
stood at Ava's side.
The world was his
listening.
hands still shaking. "I'm free," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the commotion. Ava turned to him. "Yes, but this isn't just about you anymore." He nodded, his eyes clouded with emotions too heavy to name. The scars of what had been stolen from him, years lost, his reputation shredded, would never fully heal. But for the first time, he wasn't just another name in the system. Continued, Ava watched the townspeople shift uneasily. Some whispered in shock. Others, those who had silently benefited from the corruption, looked away in shame. Lena wiped away a tear and squeezed Ava's hand. "You didn't just fight for Mark. You fought for all of them." Ava let out a slow breath, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had won. But victory tasted bitter when justice came too late. Stepping away from the courthouse that had once seemed untouchable. The ghosts of the past clung to the air, but she had ripped open the silence that had protected them for so long. As she walked down the courthouse steps, she whispered to herself, "Evil wins when good people stay silent." She would never be silent again.